Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great day. Today we explore a painful choice. James leaves the woman he loves, Depp, to return to his family and take on his responsibility as a son and a CEO. When love and duty stand on opposite sides, what would you choose? If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next videos. The sleek black car rolled slowly along the rugged red dirt road, golden dust billowing in its wake. On either side stretched terraced rice fields of deep green, mountain winds stirring the wild grass. Inside the vehicle, Mr. Hoan sat upright in the back seat, his stern face gazing out the window. Beside him, James's mother clutched her purse tightly. Her eyes reddened as if she had been crying throughout the long journey. The small, modest living room with its simple wooden furniture was bathed in warm amber afternoon light, casting slanted beams across the polished cement floor. James stood by the window, looking out at the road, his hand gripping the window frame until his knuckles turned white. He heard the car pull up outside but didn't turn around immediately. He took a deep breath, as if preparing for a battle without weapons, yet still full of fire and blood. 3 gentle, tentative knocks sounded at the door, unusually hesitant. James stood still for a long moment before finally stepping forward to open it. The door swung open to reveal Mr. Hoan and James's mother, 2 figures who had once dominated his life, now appearing far more aged and weary than his memories recalled. No one spoke in that first moment, only eyes meeting, containing far too much that could never be expressed in words. James invited them in with a simple gesture, saying nothing. Mr. Hoan entered first, his eyes glancing around the room with a complex expression, both surprised and pained to see his son living in such humble circumstances. James's mother followed, her hands trembling as she set her purse on the small table. A tense atmosphere filled the room like an invisible curtain, heavy enough to suffocate. James didn't invite them to sit. He stood in his original position, back straight, arms hanging loosely at his sides, but his eyes had changed. These were no longer the eyes of a son who always bowed his head in obedience, but those of a man who had lived long enough to know what he wanted, to know his own worth. Mr. Hoan spoke first, but his voice no longer carried its sharp edge, no longer held the commanding tone of days past. It was gravelly and slow, each word seeming to carry weight as he asked if James was well. James didn't respond, only looked straight into his father's eyes with an emotionless gaze. Mr. Hoan hesitated, looked down at the floor, then said he knew he had no right to come here, no right to ask James anything after what he had done. James's mother burst into sobs, her hand covering her mouth, trying to stifle the crying, but failing. She collapsed onto a nearby wooden chair, her shoulders shaking with each wave. Her voice choked as she called out to her son, saying she thought she had lost him. James looked at his mother with a long, pained gaze, but he remained still, not stepping forward to embrace her as a filial son would, because he knew if he softened now, everything would collapse immediately. Then Mr. Hoan spoke 2 words that James never thought he would hear from this unyielding father. "I'm sorry." Those 2 simple words seemed to freeze the room. James's eyes widened, momentarily unable to believe what he was hearing. Mr. Hoan, the proud man who never bowed his head to anyone, was now apologizing to his son with a trembling voice. He said he was sorry for imposing the life he wanted onto his son, for hiring someone to keep James's passport, for trying to trap him in a world he didn't choose. He said he was afraid of losing James, that he was all he had left, and he knew no other way to keep his son besides using force. James asked back in a cold voice whether his father called robbing his son of his freedom keeping him. Mr. Hoan nodded slowly, admitting he was wrong, but also didn't know what else to do. He mentioned the corporation, the company, everything he had spent his life building, saying it needed James. Hundreds of families needed him. He couldn't watch it all collapse. James interrupted with a harder voice, asking collapse because of what? Just because his son wanted to live his own life, just because he wanted to be James rather than the heir of the Juan family. Mr. Juan fell silent, unable to respond, only looking down at his weathered hands. Hands that once held ultimate power but now couldn't hold on to his only son. James's mother suddenly stood up, stepping closer to her son, her swollen eyes looking at James with desperation, sobbing as she asked if he knew how much she worried. She said every night she couldn't sleep, always thinking of him somewhere far away, cold, alone. She had been hospitalized twice for her heart. The doctor said she couldn't bear any more stress. She just wanted him to come home, just wanted him home. James's voice softened slightly but remained firm, saying that his mother worried about him. He knew. But had she ever asked what he wanted? Had she ever asked if he was happy living the way his parents arranged? James's mother shook her head, saying, did he think she didn't want him to be happy? Did he think she wanted him to suffer? She only wanted him to have a good life, a good future. James stepped closer to his mother, his eyes softening as he asked whose definition of a good life, his parents' definition or his own. James's mother trembled, unable to answer, only embracing James and sobbing into her son's shoulder. James stood still, letting his mother cry, but didn't embrace her back. After a long while, she let go, stepped back, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Mr. Juan spoke up with a hoarse voice, asking if his son knew how many people were waiting for him to return, how many families depended on the company. He said he no longer had the strength to hold everything together. He was old now. His health wasn't what it used to be. Without James, everything would collapse. His son could live here, could find his own peace. But what about those other people? They would lose their jobs, lose their income. What would happen to their children? James interrupted with a voice full of pain, saying, Don't use that to pressure him. He knew what his responsibilities were, knew what he owed to the company, to those people. But he also owed himself a life where he could breathe. Mr. Juan looked at his son, his eyes full of disappointment mixed with painful understanding. He knew he couldn't win this argument, not because of logic, but because he had lost the right to persuade long ago. He sighed deeply and asked what his son wanted from him. What did he want his father to do? James remained silent for a long time, then said slowly that he wanted his father to acknowledge that he had the right to live his own life, not because his father permitted it, but because it was his natural right. Mr. Juan nodded and acknowledged it completely. James's mother looked at her husband, then at her son, not knowing what to say, the air in the room becoming thick and heavy as if there wasn't enough oxygen for 3 people to breathe. James turned away, walked to the window, looking outside. The afternoon light had turned amber orange, casting rays on the distant mountains, creating a breathtakingly beautiful scene. He loved this place, loved the simplicity, loved the peace, loved the feeling of being himself each day he woke up. But he also understood responsibility, understood that what his father said wasn't entirely wrong. There were hundreds of people who truly needed the company to stand firm, families that truly depended on his decisions. James spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, as if talking to himself, not turning around, saying he was so tired of having his life decided for him, tired of living a life that wasn't his own. Here he was poor, he struggled, but he was at peace. He could be himself. Did his parents understand that? James's mother cried and said she understood. My son. She understood, but she also couldn't bear having him so far away. She couldn't sleep, couldn't live thinking of him alone in this remote place. James turned around, looked at his mother, and said he wasn't alone. That statement made Mr. Juan and James's mother start. They looked at their son with worried eyes. Mr. Juan asked with a cautious voice if he had someone here. James nodded, saying he had a family here, a small family. They showed him peace, showed him love that didn't demand. James's mother burst into tears and asked, then why didn't he bring them back? Why didn't he live with them in the city? She would accept whoever he chose as long as he came home. James shook his head, his eyes becoming distant as he said he couldn't. If he returned and brought them along, then his father would have reason to cause difficulties. He knew his father, knew what he could do when he wanted control, and he didn't want them to become targets. Mr. Juan bowed his head, unable to deny it because he knew his son was right, knew he himself had done cruel things to protect power, to keep everything under control. He said in a hoarse voice that he promised he wouldn't touch them. James laughed bitterly and asked, what value did his father's promises still hold for him? Juan felt as if a knife had been plunged straight into his heart. He knew he had lost his son's trust long ago, and there was no way to regain it. The room sank into heavy silence, 3 people standing or sitting in different positions, but all caught in the same terrible tearing. Finally, James spoke with a low but clear voice, saying he would return. James's mother lifted her head, her eyes lighting up. Mr. Juan also looked at his son, but his eyes were full of doubt, asking if he meant it. James nodded slowly, saying he would return, not for ambition, not for power. He was coming back because he couldn't let his mother continue living in fear. He was coming back because he couldn't abandon the responsibility he understood better than anyone. James's mother stood up, rushed forward to embrace her son tightly, thanking him with a trembling voice. James let his mother hold him, but his eyes looked out the window, distant and full of pain, because he knew this decision meant something else, something he couldn't say right now. Mr. Juan stood up, walked closer to his son, placed a hand on James's shoulder with a trembling voice thanking him, saying he knew this decision wasn't easy for his son. James looked straight into his father's eyes and said, "Don't think that, because he's coming back, everything will be like before. He was returning, but he would do things his own way. He would run the company, but he wouldn't let his father or anyone else decide his life anymore, Mr." Juan nodded in acceptance because he knew this was the best condition he could get. The sleek car rolled away down the dirt road, golden dust fading behind as Mr. Juan and James's mother departed. James stood in front of the house watching the car until it disappeared around the bend. He stood still for a very long time, alone in the small dirt yard, mountain wind blowing through his hair. The sky had turned pale purple, the first stars twinkling overhead. He heard gentle footsteps behind him, didn't need to turn around to know it was Depp. She walked closer, her eyes looking at James with concern but saying nothing, just standing beside him, looking toward where the car had vanished. Depp asked in a gentle voice if those were his parents. James nodded, saying nothing more. Depp asked what they said to him. James remained silent for a long time, then turned to look at Depp with eyes full of pain and said, "Let's go inside." He had something he needed to tell her. In the living room, Depp sat on the wooden chair, her hands clasped tightly together. James stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders sagging as if carrying an invisible burden. He said in a low voice, not turning around, that he had to go back. Depp flinched, but said nothing because she had been preparing for this moment for a long time, but when it actually came, it still hurt to the point of suffocation. James continued saying his parents came here. They wanted him to return to run the company. His mother was sick from worry, his father was old now, and there were hundreds of people depending on the company he couldn't refuse. Diep said in a trembling voice that she understood. James turned around, looking at Diep with eyes full of guilt, and said he was sorry. He promised to stay, promised to protect her and Ly, but now? Diep interrupted, shaking her head and saying he didn't need to apologize. She knew he had responsibilities. She didn't blame him. Diep stood up, walked closer to James, looked into his eyes with a gaze both gentle and determined, her voice small but clear, saying, "Go back then, but live with her and Ly as a family." They could return to the city together, live together. She didn't need any grand status, just needed to be with him. James looked at Diep, his heart breaking into pieces because this was what he wanted more than anything, but also what he couldn't accept. He shook his head with a pained voice and said he couldn't. Diep, if he took her and Ly back, then his father would find ways to cause difficulties. He would use every tactic to separate her from him, to remove her from his life. He knew him, knew what he was capable of. Diep said in a choked voice that she wasn't afraid. She just needed him by her side. She could endure anything. James said, but he couldn't. He couldn't watch her and Ly get hurt because of him. The conflict between him and his father wasn't just family matters, Diep. It involved old issues, involved John, involved a deeper grudge. If his father knew who she was to him, he wouldn't hesitate to turn her into a weapon to use against him. Diep listened, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't cry out loud, just stood there letting the tears fall, letting the pain overflow, but not letting it make her collapse. She asked in a shaky voice what he wanted then. James stepped closer, took Diep's hand and said he wanted her and Ly to stay here, live peacefully. He would take care of her, take care of Ly. He would send money, would ensure she had a good life, but he couldn't be with her every day. Diep pulled her hand away, stepped back and said she didn't need his money, she only needed him. James said he knew, but this was the only way to protect her. If he stayed with her, then she would be dragged into battles she had nothing to do with. He didn't want that. Diep stood still, looking at James. Then she nodded slowly because she understood. She didn't want to understand, but she understood. She said in a small voice that she only needed him to be safe, healthy, that was all. James said he felt the same. He only needed to know that she and Ly were at peace. That was enough. The two stood facing each other, the distance barely an arm's length, yet as far apart as two different worlds. James wanted to embrace Diep, wanted to say that everything would be okay, but he couldn't lie because he knew things wouldn't be okay, at least not for a long time to come. James said in a trembling voice that she and he were like two rivers, Diep, sometimes blocked by mountains, sometimes redirected by life's paths, sometimes seeming as if they would never meet again, but in the end, both still flowed toward the same direction, toward the same great sea. Diep smiled faintly, tears still flowing, and said he always knew how to say such beautiful things. But life wasn't poetry, James. Not every time did two rivers meet at the sea. James said, but they still moved in the same direction, still headed toward the same destination. Diep nodded, wiped her tears, and said she believed him. She would always believe him. No one said goodbye that night, but both understood that from that moment they had stepped onto two different paths, not because they stopped loving, but because they loved deeply enough not to drag each other into suffering, not to turn love into an unbearable burden. This story follows James, a man torn between the life he chose and the responsibilities he cannot escape. Living a peaceful, simple life with Diep and Ly, James finds warmth in ordinary moments, far from power and control. However, everything changes when his parents appear, reopening old wounds caused by years of control, manipulation, and unspoken resentment. Faced with his mother's pain, his father's apology, and the weight of a company and countless employees depending on him, James makes a painful decision. He chooses to return home, not for ambition or status, but out of responsibility and filial duty. This choice means he cannot stay with Diep and Ly. In their final conversation, there is no anger, only understanding, sacrifice, and love. They part not because their love fades, but because sometimes love means letting go to protect the ones you care about most.